My name's Tony Gleeson. I'm the Chief Executive of AIRAH, but more importantly, I chair the steering committee for the Innovation Hub for Affordable Heating and Cooling, or the Ihub. And this has been resulting in AIRAH and ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, working with us and with this group of fine people through the Integrated Design Studios to be able to provide over the last 2 years a series of projects which we're going to learn more about today. But before we start, I just want to make sure, and I think it's always important to recognise where we meet and how we come together. I'm currently sitting on in the Wurundjeri tribe, land of the Wurundjeri tribe in the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, and I want to pay my respects to those people of the Aboriginal nation, both past, present and emerging, and recognise their traditional contributions to the value of the land in which we currently sit on right across Australia and our territories. The second thing I do want to recognise is there's a number of people, a number of universities, a number of providers that have contributed greatly to this project. And so many that if you go to the Innovation Hub website, you can see those contributors. But I want to recognise and thank for them, particularly also want to thank ARENA, as their part of their contribution to this has been significant as part of their renewable energy programs in that space. But enough of me. The last 2 days have been very exciting. I expect today to be the same. I want to pass you over to Professor Lou Ai from Melbourne University, who will take us through the various projects. Enjoy today, and looking forward to all of you contributing to the future. As I said to a number of people, this isn't over. We're only about 2/3 of the way of the journey. So thank you, Lou.
Thank you, everybody. This is day 3. So day 1, what we have done is we have looked at what we call principle, and day 2 practices, and day 3 we will go through the lesson that we learn and plus what will be the next. And I'll stop sharing my screen. I would like to call Wendy to introduce your team. Wendy.
Yeah, thanks, Lou. So today, QUT's IDS that we've been running this semester, and the final studio is actually today, right now, while the students are doing their thing. So we haven't completed our studio yet. But I'd like to introduce my 2 colleagues, Naima and Lindy. So together, the 3 of us have been looking at the pedagogy of Integrated Design Studios, and we'll be reporting on that when the final reports are due early next year. But I'm going to hand over to Naima, who will talk you through what have we been doing in our design studios in Brisbane over the last 2 semesters. Thanks, Naima.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for the introductions, and thank you so much, Lou and Tony, for the earlier introductions. So today I'll be presenting an overview of the IDS process that we are running currently at the Faculty of Engineering at QUT. IDS program at QUT incorporated 2 design projects, IDS 13 and 14, to explore new ways of designing mixed-use buildings incorporating aspects of aged care. The client we had was Bolton Clark, which is a customer-led, not-for-profit organization. They're customer-centric aged care providers with a focus on improving the well-being of Bolton Clark communities. Bolton Clark's goal for the development of the mixed-use aged care projects was not very strongly rooted in net zero outputs, but whole-of-life approach of the building's performance. The process that we opted for the IDS was grounded in challenging the status quo of architectural and engineering pedagogy. In the first semester, so we had 2 semesters. In the first semester, before the current one, only electrical, mechanical, and construction management students from the final year of bachelor's degrees partnered with the consultants and academics to choose major areas of research for their project outcomes. And in semester 2, which is the current semester, these stakeholders have partnered with the architectural students and academics to develop the design outcomes. Here is an image. It's a photo we took from an early briefing session before semester 1 with all the consultants and academics. So the main purpose of the step-by-step process for semester 1 was to build design literacy among our engineering and construction management students to prepare them for the work that they had to do with the architecture students and to learn about the architectural design process for semester 2. Semester 2, the assessment brief that we developed for the students involves the integration of 9 design principles or goals that challenged the students to, and the students were asked to address each of those goals. These 9 principles were derived from the client's initial brief and the incorporation of biophilia, salutogenesis, eudaimonic architecture coupled with ESD, dementia care, inclusive design, social sustainability, spatial justice, and COVID-safe responsive architecture. All of these aspects are being explored by students in each of their individual projects through unique ways. Bolton Clark has provided 2 sites for the exploration and development of projects based in Queensland. One is in Cairns, which is shown on the left-hand side, which lies in a tropical climatic region. And the one on the right is in Caboolture, next to their existing aged care facility, which already has a multi-stage program planned, but the client was open to interpretation of the site in new ways. The 13-week-long semester process that we are finally coming to a conclusion at, we are in week 13 now, was actually broken down into 3 types of workshops that deviated away from the signature studio model. We designed 3 types of workshops to conduct with all the IDS participants in a sequential manner to facilitate design outcomes and data collection. So as you can see in the diagram here, the students had 2 interlinked assignments, and the first half of the semester's collaboration focused on rapport building, learning and sharing interdisciplinary vocabulary of practices, design brief development, site analysis, exploring constraints, and developing master plans. While the second half of the semester has focused on detailed design development, testing of ideas, and evaluation of design approaches. Here are some of the examples of the collaborative approaches that we opted in the 3 types of workshops. This is an example of a reflective workshop that we ran at the end of semester 1 with the engineering students and academics and consultants. And we looked at what worked, what didn't work, what they found that was helpful in the first semester. Then we had the introductory studio workshop at the beginning of semester 2, where engineering students introduced themselves and the main projects that they were focusing on to the architectural students. As part of the strategic workshop, which is the second kind of workshops that we've run, this was one that we ran through Zoom because of the snap lockdown at the beginning of semester 2. And in this workshop, consultants and students teamed up and they asked questions from the client representatives to build understanding about the design brief. In week 4, we ran another strategic workshop where further ongoing questions when the clients were asked, and students and consultants worked in site-based groups. So we had 2 major groups for Cairns and one group for Cairns, one for Caboolture, where students shared their vocabularies and practices to brainstorm initial responses to the 9 ideas design principles. In the strategic workshops, consultants also shared their hands-on approach with the stakeholders about testing and modeling energy use in sample spaces. Like you can see here in this photo, we have consultant Nikki, who's a sustainability consultant, and she's showing the demo of IES modeling to the students. The studio leaders from Fulton Trotter Architects also inspired students with their own design thinking, the development and approaches to design problems by sharing their own practice-based work as case studies, which the engineering students in particular found fascinating and really knowledge process too. In one of the last strategic workshops that we ran with the students and consultants, we implemented a strategy for collaboration, which we have named rotating consultancy meetings, where architectural and non-architectural students collaborated for design feedback on a 15 minutes rotation basis to maximize interaction and design outputs between the stakeholders. Here in this photo, you can see that the studio architecture students groups are working on one hand through the face-to-face context, and on the right-hand side, they're working through a dual delivery mode where we had one of the studio leaders and consultants join students. One of the things that we observed was that when consultants gave their expert suggestion to architecture students, the students received feedback through both through showing and telling, which means that their design ideas could be tested and reiterated through the graphical and development. There were also opportunities for students to form peer-to-peer groups in an organic manner and to collaborate with each other. Here in this photo that's represented, and I think that's something that became much more organic and vivid towards the end of semester 2, where architectural, construction management and electrical engineering students are collaborating with each other. In addition to this short overview of the process that we've opted for, we have compiled a video which showcases the perspectives of the stakeholders on the IDEAS 14 process through the 6 thinking hats framework of G4NO. So what I'll do is that I'll stop sharing the presentation and I'll play the YouTube video. And there's 6 questions related to each of these hats that we asked different participants, and they answered those questions.
Look, the way we went about it was fairly long-winded. It's run over a whole year, and so the engineers in some respects had a pretty tough time because they were kind of designing in a vacuum to a very loose terms of reference from the client, and I would have found that would have been quite difficult for them because they had to think quite abstractly about what systems might be appropriate for this particular type of architecture, which was very generic. Generic. It was about architecture and housing for elder residents or older groups of people, but integrated with some other functions that Bolt and Clark were quite liberal to talk about or to assess. So
that first semester was basically to try to get those engineers to be like, each one will be responsible for a certain technology or aspect, so that they will be the actual experts by the time the architecture co-designers are involved.
And that was the kind of the exciting bit when we got into the second semester, when you got them finally together, and there was kind of almost a cultural exercise to overcome to begin with, where you had to set up relationships for the semester, and that's not easy because you're dealing with another species of people, engineers versus architects and so forth. And so I think for the students it was quite confronting, and they had to hear from the engineers about what systems they were dreaming about and thinking about. And to them, I think in some respects it was a foreign language, and so there was an issue. We talked a lot about language and how we work together. But it was kind of interesting through the semester how they eventually all warmed up and the relationships improved, and then that dialogue really started to go, particularly when the architects were putting lines on paper and coming up with early ideas with the engineers. That's when the dialogue really started to take off.
I think it was a great opportunity to get exposure to what it's going to be like working in industry rather than just having the hard cut between academia and then expecting to go out and working professionally. It was good to get exposure to consultants in lots of different fields, not only my own being electrical, there was also mechanical, energy, sustainability, there was civil, structural consultants to speak to and get a more of a transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary understanding of what goes into actually producing a sustainable net zero outcome rather than just being siloed, and understanding my own process and presenting that at the end of the day, working in an integrated environment with the architects from the beginning rather than just being handed a design and expecting our systems to fit into it.
So currently the common practice in the built environment is just that it's very linear. So it's like, for example, the architect, they finish the design and then they hand it over to the engineers, and it gets handed over in a linear manner. But it shouldn't be this way. It should be a collaborative interaction from the early beginnings of the design. So each one involved should actually see themselves as a co-designer, not as a person who's just providing a service or something for that project.
I think one of the big challenges with a project like this, where you're working with people from so many different disciplines who've never worked together before, is establishing that common ground and being able to actually bridge some of the difficulties, I guess, of communicating with people with different communication styles, different work styles, different experiences. I think it's pretty hard to just be dropped into a group like that and not have that rapport or that understanding in order to be able to effectively collaborate. So
I think it would have been beneficial in the first semester, and this is probably feedback we should have given in the first semester, is to have a, I guess, introduction to building services or building services 101, where probably the architects probably have a better idea of possibly of that kind of thing. I'm not sure what units they complete, but from an engineering degree perspective, there's no building services thing. So we know, I guess, for example, how much electricity a wire can carry, but in terms of estimating the amount that a building would use, and then using rules of thumb to figure out how big these conduits need to be, how big the services spaces need to be, how big the false ceiling might need to be to carry mechanical ducts, air ducts, and electrical services, sprinkler systems, things like that. The nuts and bolts of it.
And I've been very confident consulting with all the different various consultants, engineers, architects, and it's been very beneficial to see how they work together. I also feel as though a more scaled down version of this IDS should be offered to students, whether it be a core or elective subject, just to give them the experiences that we have had so that they are able to know how each of the different professions gel together, rather than going through their whole degree only learning about solely their own profession.
It's very different doing this IDS unit compared to previous years. I'm currently in my master's, so I've been doing architecture for 5 years straight, and this is the first time in my final semester that we've been introduced to working with the students from other disciplines. So it's been definitely a learning curve. Traditional studios, normally it's a very fast-paced process where we get the task and we just have to sort of think it through within a short period of time without much consultation. Of course with our tutors, yes, but not on a very broad range or grand scale of things. So being able to really discuss with the non-architecture students from the very beginning for weeks on end what felt like, which was great, was a really great experience, because I feel like we got a very well-rounded idea of where we were wanting to take our designs.
for this project, designing for aged care. It was really interesting to consider, or to start by considering how high the power consumption is. It was one of the things that, immediately we start doing those calculations and working out how much solar you're going to need to power this. You go, well, let's take a step back. Is there something that we can do from a more holistic point of view in terms of how we design the building, the orientation of that building, the construction system, the wall-to-window ratios, and then how we cool the building, what our strategy is there around mechanical ventilation and cooling, and taking that sort of big picture view of how these different systems can work together to achieve this goal of reducing the overall energy use of the building.
Yeah. So from my electrical engineering background, I saw many good ideas, and one of them quite amazed me. That was a solar roof. The roof completely solar panel. There's no other things, and from the design part of it, I really liked it. And of course, technology is another thing we need to make it happen, support it. And that's something that really amazed me. It was from an architecture student.
Right. Okay. And do you reckon they responded well enough to the engineering requirements that are around? Did they face it the wrong way, or?
No, I think it was the right way. And
good.
The good design. Maintenance and operation, it can be an issue, because if it's completely solar roof, and then how can we make it happen and install and things like that? But we already have solar wall, I think. Why can't we have another solar roof?
Correct. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think one of the students mentioned the idea of actually involving this process earlier in their career at the university with simpler projects, because I think this project has been pretty overwhelming. It's been overwhelming teaching it, and I think for the students there's just so much they've had to cover, because part of the requirements of an architect in the final year is that they have a sufficiently complex project to work on, and then you add the layers then of engineering that go on top of that, which is good, they need to know that. That's pretty overwhelming. So I think the idea of doing this kind of studio at a more simplistic level earlier would have a lot of benefits for those students coming into then final year, because they'd be expecting it.
From my point of view, I feel like if something's missing, or how can we do it better if this happens the next time, I feel if we could have a bit of, for example, 20 minutes or 30 minutes a workshop or lecture dedicated on one topic each week.
Yeah.
For example, 1 week is about solar energy, 1 week about solar system monitoring or modeling, and something that, for example, Sharif is very good at. Another week just about air conditioning, 20 minutes, 30 minutes.
I agree. I think that would be great.
I do feel as though more effort and support should be given to the students in the early stages of the projects, so that they are able to understand for the future aspects of the project how it all gels together, and how our own project ideas can collaborate with the architects and the engineers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that is our presentation for today from QUT. I hope you all enjoyed it, and we have been able to provide you a snapshot with the ideas 13 and 14 process that we've undertaken.
Thank you very much, Naima, and your team.
Thanks.
Now I would like to call for Dominic. Would you like to say something?
Yes, I actually had a question. Is there time for a bit of a Q&A?
I would rather leave it to the end. If you want one question, please.
One quick question. Yeah, I was quite fascinated to hear about the construction managers being part of this as well. And we had a conversation earlier in how far it's also something like a QS, construction manager, and so forth, being part of that sort of conversation. Because very often what we want as the engineers or architects is easy in a way, but then we have the cost side of things coming in. So what was their experience? Is there maybe just a quick comment or anecdote that you could give us on how the construction managers felt as part of that team?
I might comment on that because I look after the construction management students. So last week in one of the studios, I was speaking to the construction management student who said he's amazed how little architects know about materials, the strengths of materials. And he said, I'm amazed at how well they can bring together a conceptual design, but they'll have something heavy being supported by something that'll fall down. So he was expressing both amazement at the skills of the architecture students, but amazement at the lack of understanding of materials. And the second thing was he had just got a job with a major project in Brisbane as a construction manager. And because of his involvement in this IDS studio, this construction company put him in the design team, going out on site with the client and the design team and the site manager to see how things are being implemented in practice. So he really benefited from this process.
Fantastic, thanks. Really good to hear. Good story. Over to you, Lou.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Dominic. Now I would like to call from Monash team.
So we're the Monash Solar Decathlon team. I'm Sav, one of 5 members who've come around. So if you could go to the next slide. So Monash Solar Decathlon team is basically a multidisciplinary student team. We are a mix of engineering and architecture students and a bunch of other fields. And if you go to the next slide, you can see it's sort of really spread around evenly. We have a pretty good split between genders, and we basically compete in the Solar Decathlon competition. You just go to the next slide. And we have to design net zero buildings that are sustainable for this competition. And they come at this really holistic kind of perspective. So really broad range of topics, and that's how our disciplines really help. We submitted 3 designs in the 2019 Design Challenge, 2020 Design Challenge, and we'll be going through them today. So Tom, take it away with the first one.
Oh, that's actually me. Sorry. Hi, I'm Sarah, and I am part of one of the sub-teams of MSDT that competed in the urban single-family home division of the Solar Decathlon competition. So our team created what we call the Flexi Home, which is a net zero house based in Melbourne suburb of Middle Park. Next slide. So a key feature of the Flexi Home is that it can function as 2 separate residences or as a single residence, depending on what the occupants need. This makes the home suitable for occupants at almost all stages of their life. So if you have a young family that need the entire space, or if you've got an elderly couple who maybe require less space but could benefit from the second residence having a carer living there instead. It also uses disability-friendly design and occupies a minimal plot size. So this was to respond to issues like urban sprawl and accessible living. And of course, the Flexi Homes also, we designed it to be as energy efficient as possible to lower its environmental impact as well. So next slide. So I'm just going to go over some of the basic layouts and design of the building. So if we go to the next slide, you can see when it functions as 2 separate residences. You have the primary residence on the bottom floor, which is shown in orange on your left, and this is the level which is wheelchair accessible. And then you have the secondary residence on the 1st and 2nd floors as shown in blue. Next slide. So when it's functioning as 2 separate residences, it was designed so as both have their own entrances, their own green spaces, outdoor spaces, and their own utilities. We go to the next slide. They did share a common laundry area, and this also functions as interior access between the 2 residences, which allows the whole building to have that function as one residence for if you have a single family living in it. Next slide. And then finally, when we were designing it, we wanted to create a really high quality living space, tried to make it feel light, open, and give it a strong connection to nature. So this was incorporating aspects like high ceilings, open plan living, lots of windows throughout it to make sure that there was natural light, natural ventilation, and then plenty of green spaces and indoor-outdoor living areas. So now I'll pass to Tom, who's going to go over some of the more technical details about design.
Yep, cool. Thank you, Sarah. Next slide, sir. Yep, so I'll just go over the Hvac system first. So basically what we did is we separated the ventilation and the heating and cooling systems into 2 separate ducting systems. So for the ventilation, we have like a 90% efficient heat recovery ventilator. And when we designed this, we wanted to ensure that there's 1.5 air changes per hour going to each of the rooms. So for that, we just assumed a 0.7 like air infiltration. And so, yeah, we're just basically mechanically generating 0.8 air changes per hour throughout the house. We also have like exhaust outlets in the kitchen and bathrooms and supplying air into the main areas, such as the lounge room and the bedrooms. We also have the HRV fitted with a filter that removes up to 80% of smoke particles, which is also necessary for Melbourne. Next slide. Yep, so for the heating and cooling, we basically designed it to be a 10 kilowatt system, which can handle the maximum cooling load of 9.7 kilowatts, and it's a centralized reverse cycle air-to-air heat pump. We also have these outlets placed at like opposite sides of the rooms as to encourage airflow. Next slide. Yep. So as I said, this project has to be net zero. So to do that, we also have double glazed windows and seasonal shading. For our solar panel system, we also have 29 solar panels with a hybrid battery. Next slide. Yep. So also in this, one of the main features that we had was a rooftop garden. So we made sure to include native plants, as these are far more drought resistant. Next slide. Yep. And also, yeah, we just wanted to make sure we had a high quality level of insulation. So we have earthful batting as well as like extruded insulation as well, just to get like a higher R value. Next slide. Yep. And lastly, the total cost was $425,000, which was $45,000 above code compliant home. Next slide. Yep. So Sarah and I will be around as well for the Q&A if you have any more questions. And I'll pass it on to Sav, who will do the attached housing.
Yeah, thanks, John. So I'll be taking the attached housing division's design. We designed a domestic violence refuge for victims of domestic violence. If you go to the next slide, we actually partner with Cara House, which is an organization that deals directly with women that kind of come out of these situations, and they handle everything for them. And so we wanted to cater to all their needs and kind of the things that they've found missing in their previous refuges. So this is basically for transition housing. So if you go to the next slide, we've got a series of goals that we use to kind of guide it. We wanted to make sure it had purpose-built spaces. The spaces were also flexible, which is one of the requirements that we got from Cara House. Security and privacy, obviously really important. A design that was also easy to operate with low maintenance costs, and it had an appeal to stakeholders. So to speak to the purpose-built space, if you go to the next slide, we had a really simple layout. As you can see, there's the block A, the block 1 at the top and block 2 at the bottom include the standard units. And then in block 4 and 5, we've got additional multi-purpose spaces and staff areas for the Cara House staff to actually monitor the situation, like the women and stuff. And then you've also got in the center sensory gardens and kids areas for them to have a bit of fun. Like it's not like a really kind of boring space for them. They get to enjoy the space. So it's really practical, and we try to make it look really colorful, a little bit different. And if you go to the next slide, that layout takes in the security and privacy aspect. So just the U-shaped layout, kind of facing everything away to the road. You can't really look inside. That was really important to them when we designed it. And we also have those additional cameras, as you can see. We've got so layers of active and passive security. If you go to the next slide, we have some really good thermal envelopes, high efficiency windows, and all that jazz to make sure we're reducing the energy usage to heat up our spaces. And then we also took real consideration into the material choices we made for everything we did in these envelopes. If you also go to the next slide, we also made it important in our design to make sure we had really good acoustic insulation, because for this kind of house, the occupants are kind of sensitive to, the others involved. There's usually like loud noises and stuff. So really important to have, even though we had adjacent units, they are pretty good at isolating noise. If you go to the next slide, one of our highlight features was that flexible layout. So on the top floor, we have a movable wall, and it allows the design to have a different amount of bedrooms when required. If you go to the next slide, you get a better view of how the units that are adjacent, they can change and adapt. They can have extra number of bedrooms to accommodate a larger family if they need to, and then a single woman can take up the other one, or they can be put into the standard size. And yeah, so really, really important. We got that kind of feedback from Cara House, who said they would often not be able to use some of their spaces because of with women taking up the whole space, they didn't have enough beds for bigger families. So this was really a highlight feature for them. If you go to the next slide, our ventilation system was basically made up of a fan coil unit that did the bulk of the heating and cooling, and then a heat recovery ventilator to handle any of the improving efficiencies, reducing wastage, also for kind of changing air and stuff like that. On the next slide, you can see because of that, the work that we did with the ventilation systems and a really good envelope, we got really, really low energy usage compared to a standard refuge that we have to actually build. The energy savings are massive, and compared to a standard home, it's amazing energy performance, and meant that we made something that was practical and energy efficient for Cara House. So that's all. I'll pass it on to Sarah and Anastasia for the school.
Yep, thank you. Hi everyone. So my name is Sarah, and I'll be talking about the elementary or primary school division along with Anastasia. So our team, the New Kids on the Dock, designed a net zero inclusive primary school that's based in Docklands. We chose Docklands because it's part of the Urban Renewal project, which is funded by the government in an effort to revitalise the community. Moreover, there's an urgent need to build more primary schools in the city area. Our school has been designed with these 4 design goals in mind, including minimizing the environmental footprint of our building by proposing an energy efficient design and maximizing the circularity of the building overall. We also wanted to accommodate for students with special needs, those needs including students with vision, hearing, or mobility impairment. And we did this by incorporating various inclusive design elements throughout our school. And we also implemented various features throughout our school that aim to nurture sustainable habits in our students that they hopefully take with them into the future. And lastly, we wanted to engage with the wider community by integrating the school into the local context and also transforming into public spaces outside of school hours. And here in this diagram, you can see the spatial organization of our school. So the facilities that are shared with the public outside of school hours, such as the sports hall, the library, and also just the open space in front of the actual building itself, are all on the ground floor for security reasons and also ease of access by the public outside of school hours, of course. And if you can see, there's a helix ramp that goes through the center of our school, and it runs from the ground floor to the 3rd floor. And this, coupled with the elevators around the school, greatly enhances wheelchair accessibility to all the floors. And lastly, we also have informal learning spaces throughout the school that encourage active learning outside of the classrooms. And now I'll pass it on to Anastasia.
Thank you, Sarah. So a key goal of our project was to reach net zero energy, where our building produced as much energy as it consumed. Next slide. So we first aimed at achieving this by reducing our energy usage as much as possible through passive energy strategies, such as thermal chimneys. So the thermal chimneys draw on the vertical nature of our school to increase natural ventilation throughout the building. They use a combination of air movement from the wind and thermal siphoning to encourage stacked ventilation to move from the low to high elevations and eject the warm air through the sawtooth roof vent system. We also placed vents on the ground floor of our south-facing walls to take advantage of the prominent southerly wind during the warmer months. Next slide. We then offset the remaining energy usage with a photovoltaic system on the roof and a hybrid battery system. Next slide. So reaching net zero energy helped us reduce our carbon emissions during the operational stage of the building. However, we wanted to reduce our environmental impact at all life cycle stages. So one example is at the end of life stage of our building, we incorporated design for disassembly principles. So we used high quality materials to ensure everything was lasting as long as possible. We used mechanical connections like bolts and screws, and then we wrote a detailed disassembly plan, as you can see in these diagrams. Next slide. So overall, this meant that at the end of our building's useful life, we could disassemble it rather than demolish it to ensure all of the building materials could then be used on future projects. Next slide. So overall, this helped us achieve a building circularity score of 87%, which considered both of our input materials and then how we use these materials at the end of the building's life. Next slide. So overall, you've seen all three of the divisions we competed in last year. Going forward into the competition, we're going to compete in the Build Challenge and the Design Challenge, where we're building a transitional house for domestic violence victims and designing a retirement village. Next slide. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. If anyone had any feedback or thinks they can help at all, feel free to reach out to us on our socials shown here, and we'd be more than happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Solar Technology. And do we have questions?
We might have to highlight that questions need to be asked via the Q&A channel.
Yes.
So if you had any questions, please put them there. That would be great to have some responses. I have to say it's fantastic work. So I really enjoy seeing all these projects. They're all somewhat different. They all show things about, of course, zero carbon from different angles. Maybe one question, I can't remember which presentation it was. I think it was the second or third presentation about the sort of the mechanical systems. And maybe from my end, just a bit curious how you got introduced to how they work, how they, from a technical perspective, how to incorporate that as a designer into your work. And we know as an architect, I know that these systems can be quite daunting for us because we don't know much about what it is that they do and how they influence our designs. And so maybe putting the question onto the team, at what point were you actually, because those of you who were dealing with those systems, how were you including the thoughts about the ventilation and sizing, for instance, and positioning of the equipment? I remember with our studios, there was a lot of conversation about where do you put your equipment, how do you service your equipment, and so forth. So what role did that play as part of your design?
Yeah, I could speak to that. So we spent a lot of time, as a team, doing calculations and things like that. But we also spoke to, actual companies, engineering firms to get advice on all of our kind of systems, and like the fan coil unit and the heat recovery ventilator there. We made sure that it would be able to serve both those spaces at the same time. And so we got the values and stuff from our actual suppliers, and yeah, it was definitely a joint effort. Yeah.
And can I just add to that? With our thermal chimneys for our school, we actually interviewed a couple of schools that are known for having a sustainable design, and they actually had thermal chimneys in their school. So we asked them about how it all works and what specifics, what specs they have. Yeah, so that was a really great inspiration for our design.
Yeah.
Lou, I wouldn't mind sneaking in a quick question if that's
yes, please.
I don't have access to Q&A, I think, as a host. But look, really impressive work, I agree with Dominic. And I was really impressed at the breadth of different disciplines you had involved, even business people from memory. Just wondering what the format was in trying to bring everybody together. Did you bring everyone together at once, or was it like little parts of the team? And how enthusiastic were some of the maybe less built environment disciplines like business and those sorts of things in getting involved in the design?
Yeah, we come at it like we recruit as in looking for people that are sustainability focused at first. So it really is a group effort. It's not bringing in people from randomly. It's everyone's really passionate about this team. It's the only way these kind of things happen. I know for us in the best way possible. We collaborate the best that way. Yeah.
And did you get together in one large group and just sort of?
Yeah, over Zoom when we had for most of the year, and then once we got to kind of open up, we did come in person and do big sessions over multiple days, especially leading up to the competition, massive study sessions, and just cranking out our submissions. Yeah,
right,
all together.
Well
we got a question from the audience asking about how you optimize your building fabric and making sure that no thermal breaching and sort of things there. I think one of you could answer for one design for this because of the time limitation. We could do this at the end too. Yeah.
Tom, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I guess also what helped with a lot of this stuff is that to participate in the competition, like you have to do building science lectures. So it just gives everyone like an idea of how all these layers work and whatnot. But yeah, I don't know. It was basically, I guess, a combination of like research and just making sure that, we had like house wrap, so the building was airtight, and the thermal bridging was, I don't know, I guess including all the parts where it should be. What was the other question? We also did a lot of our modeling on Design Builder, I guess, for like to figure out how much solar gains we have and like, where the sunlight will be let in and how that will affect, I guess, the energy usage too.
Okay, thank you very much. If we have more questions, we could discuss and talk about at the end. Okay, thank you. And I would like to call what we call Gumji and David for their experience in our Integrated Design Studio at Melbourne Uni, and David from perspective from consulting point of view, and Gumji from the tutor point of view, studio leader point of view. Yeah, Gumji.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Lou. I'm really glad to be here presenting some of the students' work and reflecting on the studio's work as well. So I might just share my screen. So I'll be presenting from obviously the studio leader's perspective, as Lou mentioned, and then I'll pass over to David as an advising consultant. My name is Gumji Kang, and I'm an architect and a project leader with a design studio, Snowdon, and I'm also a studio leader with Melbourne School of Design, University of Melbourne. So this was the work done as part of IDS4 with Ambulance Victoria. So as part of the presentation, I'll briefly touch on some of the process behind the studio, from studio brief, establishing and sort of research that was carried out in the studio, and then some of the process behind the ideation and exploration, design development, and some select student works. And then I'll make a brief observation at the end. So to begin with, really the brief of the studio was to provide a concept design development of zero carbon Ambulance Victoria branch and identification of potential environmentally sustainable design initiatives that Ambulance Victoria could carry out either in short-term or long-term sense. So as part of the studio, we had an extensive involvement from Ambulance Victoria from the very beginning of the studio all the way throughout. And then we obviously had Etley 10 as our advising consultant, and we also had Ed Yu as architecture as advising architect from Ambulance Victoria side. So to begin, at the beginning of the studio, something that I do have to note is that it was entirely virtual studio, as most of you guys in Victoria would already be aware. And we had experimented with a number of different digital, studio delivery methodology and different platforms. And we did start the studio with teams in terms of accumulating studio contents and materials and being able to communicate within the studio. And that worked really successfully, both in a smaller group setting and in a broader, sort of wider communication method. Then we also incorporated an online digital board called Milanote, and it's a kind of similar one to Miro or any other online digital board that you may be familiar with. And we also integrated Zoom to really sort of enhance activity and interaction with the students a little bit better. So this was a quick snapshot of how the Miller Note was set up. And then it really looks at how the students really organise themselves within the groups and also organise their works to ensure that everyone could really freely go in and have a look at someone else's work and also be able to share in between the studios as well. And then going into the client, so at the beginning of the studio, we had a series of interviews with Ambulance Victoria team from the ESD division, project management division, and of course the paramedics as well. This was obviously key for the students to really understand the clients and also learn about how they can communicate with the clients as well. I think some of the key learning objectives that we had at the very beginning of the studios is for the students to really learn how to communicate with non-designers and also various stakeholders within the design process. And then we had a series of workshops with Ambulance Victoria architect at yours, just to understand the parameters and some of the constraints and opportunities with the actual ambulance branch design for the students to really engage with some of the more technical details within the construction constraints. Before we really got into the ideation stage, we also had a series of presentations from other benchmark projects around Victoria. And this was really to begin the conversation with the students around the sustainable design. And we're looking at the sustainable design from not just the environmental sustainability perspective, but also ecological, social, and financial feasibility. So we looked at Parks Victoria, Burwood Brickworks Shopping Centre, and Wongaroo Droom Community Centre as an aspect of sustainable design that really reaches beyond the environmental sustainable side of things. And this was quite an interesting moment for both the architecture and engineering students, so that they could really look at how some of the built examples that are, I guess, at the forefront of the sustainable design and how they were achieving those through built projects. We move on to the ideations. The beginning, it was really important for us to really get the students to develop the understanding of net zero carbon design, but also ESD first principles. So a lot of these students within the studio, we have mix of first year and second year Master of Architecture students, and then Master of Engineering students. So the varying degrees of skills and knowledges really had to be sort of bridged at the beginning of the studio, just as part of that. Establishing that first principle was really at the beginning of the ideation, and then we moved on to more in-depth site analysis and precedent study. Something that I would like to note here was these works were all done in groups to ensure that there was interactions within the student body, but making sure that an engineering student was always integrated within those groups. So all of those groups are allocated one engineering student each within the group. So just so that engineering students weren't isolated in a separate group. So moving on to idea sharing, this was mainly just to talk about how we explored both small group setting idea sharing and a bigger group sort of presentation style idea sharing. So we all know the usual sort of studio pinup setup, but in this case, in the digital studio format, it was really important for the students to have an environment where they could share ideas in a small group setting as well, where they can share their ideas and communicate in a rather sort of casual and informal manner. Whereas we found that in a larger group, presentation settings, the students can get quite rigid and formal in terms of presenting their ideas. So it needed to sort of tag in between to balance out those. If we briefly go into the design development process, one thing that we did incorporate was really revisiting some of the interview contents from what we had at the beginning of the studio with the paramedics and the construction and the development team from Ambulance Victoria to understand sort of the human scale needs and the requirement of each activities, and also within sort of the key spaces that needed to be understood in a very detailed manner. So these are some of the series of drawings that the students collated as part of the design development exercise. And then this is just a quick snapshot of how we usually sort of worked around the weekly pin-up exercise. So it was really to ensure that everyone had something to talk about every studio, and to ensure that you could see everyone else's work in a quite open platform. So I'll be going through 3 key works from the studio, and this ranges from sort of the second year, first semester, and then first year, first semester as well. So you'll be able to see quite a range of skills and design resolution as well. So to start with, I'll start with Vincent's work. The site plan, you can see that there was quite a few key parameters around the spatial requirement of the Ambulance Victoria. So the garage space, and then sort of living and the dining spaces, the resting areas, and then a large garden spaces were all part of the key requirement that needed to be developed according to each student's sort of design objectives. But Vincent looked at a number of different ways in which the Ambulance Victoria could sort of take on as a future initiatives. And then they range from some of the more experimental design initiatives all the way down to quite a small scale achievable design initiative. So we can look at some of the more experimental things like the PV garage and integrated charging stations for the vehicles, and the integrated landscape and wetlands system into their garden spaces, and then community spaces that really start to bring the community into the Ambulance Victoria site to really open up this branch as a community hub. And then some of the other sort of small scale designs that you can see in the sort of following drawings. So this one really looks at some of the constructed wetlands within the back garden spaces. And if we go into the sections, you can see how they have developed from the previous ergonomic studies, and then they start sort of fitting their spaces into the various key areas that have developed from both ergonomic studies and also the design requirement for Ambulance Victoria. So some of these technical, I guess, design requirements were done in partnership with AIRAH 10 and also engineering students, where they advised the architectural students on the systems that they were sort of looking to develop. So these, I guess the wetland integration is a key example where it was an idea that the students wanted to explore, and then they collaborated with the engineering students to find the most suitable solution that could be integrated into the site. With these representations or the renders, the studio really focused on communicating those ideas quite clearly to both the stakeholders, and noting that some of these imageries in real life practice can be used in sort of public communications. So we did focus a lot on sort of finessing these images in terms of making sure that it was truly reflective of the users and who it will be communicated to as well. So I'll flick through some of these images quite briefly. And this is something that David will touch on a little bit later, but each student did go into a little more technical details in terms of how design would be achieving passive house design principles and sort of calculations of the carbon emissions as well. The second student is Zoe, and one thing that I will probably talk about Zoe's work is mainly looking at the material research. So Zoe was a relatively, I guess, inexperienced student in terms of the environmentally sustainable design principles, but one thing that she did really want to explore was new materiality that could be integrated as part of the design solutions. So the material that she looked at was ETFE, and how that could be adapted into various different functions of the Ambulance Victoria branch. So these are some of the images showing where she had integrated ETFE and various other ESD initiatives that she had proposed for this branch. And then a lot of these sections are really just touching on, again, those first principles in terms of ventilations and orientations for the branch design. And again, looking at some of the detailed sections in terms of students understanding how those technologies actually integrate into the building, but also be able to communicate this back to the stakeholders. So we explored a lot of different methodology and different ways in which the drawings could communicate both the technology in a quite a simple manner, but be able to be quite didactic, so the stakeholders or the non-designers could really understand what we were proposing. The last student's work is Robin's, and again, this one that I wanted to touch on was the integration of the landscape work and then probably some of the programmatic suggestions that Robin had done for this proposal. So apart from sort of the usual gamut of spaces like the living spaces and the dining area, she also looked at various different study spaces and the rest space for the paramedics that could be integrated within the branch spaces, and also some of the other really small design details that could be integrated as part of further development for the branch design. So here's some of the views that she was looking at as part of the landscape integration. And so all of these were fairly well received from Ambulance Victoria in terms of where the typical ambulance branch doesn't really look at sort of landscape solution as something that they need to improve upon. But a lot of the proposals that students looked at focused on those small opportunities that could be improved with Ambulance Victoria. To summarise some of the observations that I had was really creating an environment for open discussion so the students felt safe and sort of unjudged for any of the comments they could make, and then providing opportunities for a variety of interaction, as mentioned, in a small group setting, a bigger group setting, and a really open forum with the stakeholders and consultants. And then including engineers from the onset of projects. I think this was echoed many times with other speakers as well. And this one, next one is something that I really want to point in on for everyone, is providing support and toolkits for the engineers and non-designers to participate in ideation and in design development. So I think we often forget that non-designers or anyone who doesn't necessarily have an experience in these design development or ideation process, we need to be able to provide those process and toolkits for them to be part of the discussion. And this was something that IDS really looked at it in details. Last comment is for the students to really shoot for the moon first and then taking a step back later. That's all for me, and I'll hand over to David.
Thanks, Gumji. I'll just share my screen. Brilliant. Can you all see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes, David. Thank you. You have 10 minutes, David.
Great. Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me to come and give some feedback from our involvement, which was as the consultant on the Ihub 04, the Ambulance Victoria project. And really, one of the great outcomes from this project was that we were able to corral the student work into a very coherent net zero pathway for Ambulance Victoria. So it was a really good success from our point of view, and I'll talk about some of the ways we worked through that. Just as an introduction, my name's David Ritter. I'm director here at Atelier 10 in Melbourne. We're a firm of building services engineers specialised in sustainability, and really our mantra is to do more with less, to make buildings and landscapes work harder, perform beautifully, to deliver good passive environmental performance and minimize the need for active systems. So it's really critical to have design integration and interdisciplinary working to make that happen. What we brought to the process was, in the first off, it's really important for a project to have a very ambitious brief. We didn't need to do much in that regard because Ambulance Victoria had done their research and brought along some very clear and prescriptive briefing materials to the project. And particularly from a sustainability perspective, they've done research around the world and they're very excited about a potential ambulance station of the future, a zero carbon ambulance station. So that was a very clear mandate for the studio, was to try and investigate this. And we put it to the students, what does a zero carbon ambulance station look like? Well, can you achieve it, first of all? And what does it look like? So we wanted them to tell us whether they could achieve it or not and tell us what it looked like. It was a really ideal opportunity to try and embed some tools to enable this in the project. An ambulance station is rather like a large family home with a few extra bits and pieces, like a bigger garage, some bigger sort of refrigeration equipment for medical supplies and that kind of thing, but it was very much of the residential scale. So it was very apt to use the Passive House planning package, which is a calculation tool that's open source. It's an Excel spreadsheet, and we were able to adapt that tool, because it's quite a complex tool for anyone just starting out, such that they had some very prescribed sort of entry points for data into that tool, which would enable the architects and engineers to collaborate on both the engineering and architectural systems. So that collaboration worked very successfully. We gave them some training sessions at an appropriate point in the process when they were starting to generate forms and ideas, and they were able to follow that through, and all students submitted a PHPP model at the end of the process. So it was really great to analyze some of their workings. We also, alongside that, put forward the use of eTool, which is a life cycle analysis software. Again, it's a relatively easy tool for students to use. It's hard to use it when you don't have a lot of detail on your project, but nevertheless, it's not too complex. It's kind of like a glorified spreadsheet, really, for putting data in about the volumes of your materials and the environmental impacts data for those materials. So we were able to follow that through such that students could get a picture of the whole life cycle of the building, both in terms of its embodied carbon and its operational carbon, and to try and offset that, if you like, with the potential for renewable energy generation on site. So looking at this kind of energy balance, or effectively like a sort of net zero potential for their project. And so that was one of the key questions: can you do it? And so we asked them to work through this process together and come up with the answer. When we did the vetting, which is part of the IDS process, so after the students' works have been completed and handed in, we look at how did they perform, and all of the students were able to complete the PHPP modeling process. Some of the students carried out the eTool modeling process, and most of the students were able to demonstrate convincingly that there was a net zero carbon potential for their project. In addition, they identified a number of low carbon construction measures, passive design measures, energy efficiency and renewable energy technology measures, and then some other more interesting sustainability initiatives for their project. We asked them to specifically produce a set of information at the end of the exercise, which was to explain their scheme either with an isometric or a section. It's very important that the students are focused on how their sustainability initiatives integrate into the architectural form. We also asked them to report on their passive operation potential through PHPP modeling, and also to report the overall sort of net zero carbon potential for 50-year life cycle, and to give a narrative alongside that. So every student produced one of these A3s as part of their submission. And as you can see, some great graphics and ways of explaining the concepts for their projects. Our role extended beyond the studio, so we actually vetted the work afterwards. So we went through all the projects, really looking at where they'd focus their attention in terms of delivering potential for net zero carbon. And this was a report that went out to the team, goes out to the client, Ambulance Victoria. So really, looking at where they'd focused, it was really on this net zero carbon pathway, but solutions which also brought health, well-being, and operational savings to their projects. Some of the passive measures, it was interesting, because generally the typical building for Ambulance Victoria is not too bad in terms of passive design potential. It's, like I said, rather like a large domestic property with good natural ventilation, generally high thermal mass, generally good form factor. But what they brought to that was looking in detail at some of the wall build-ups, particularly the difference between walls that contain steel studs or timber studs, and how dramatically different they perform because of the thermal bridging effects. Looking at using the PHPP to help with their passive design potential, so form, orientation, shading, and also looking at the importance of airtightness, so looking at different airtightness targets and how that translates into the way they think about their detailing. Natural ventilation is obviously really important for the bulk of the year, but it was quite interesting that what the thinking about what happens in winter, and most students incorporated heat recovery ventilation, as we saw in the earlier schemes from the Monash students. So they were looking at different options for a little centralized mechanical ventilation with heat recovery unit, or decentralized sort of through the wall type HRV units. In terms of the active systems, there was definitely a tendency to look at decoupling the fresh air supply and the HVAC systems for heating and cooling, and really being focused on the delivery of an all year round resilient, potentially filtered, good source of fresh air. A lot of ambulance stations are located in acoustically challenging situations, as you can imagine. They're close to big roads. So it's important to think about how you can get good fresh air through a mechanical system such as this, whilst allowing that opportunity for natural ventilation. Hot water systems were an interesting one. Some of the students looked at integrating systems with solar heating, solar water heating potential, heat pumps, electric heat pumps, and some of the students actually looked at instantaneous domestic hot water, because actually the usage of water turns out it was very light at ambulance stations, and so that's a way of minimizing standing losses and saving space. So there were different approaches to that, which was quite interesting. In terms of renewable energy systems, the solar panels were really a no-brainer. Obviously generating renewable energy, but helping potentially with resilience. And this was one of the questions around batteries was looked at, not necessarily cost effective right now, but could be part of a resilient system offering some form of backup to essential systems. The other opportunities that students really looked at were, the embodied carbon choices. Most students tended towards timber construction and using some innovative sort of mass timber type constructions or prefabricated solutions, modular, having lots of efficiency in terms of their delivery and construction times. Water harvesting, as you've seen, some of the students looked at water treatment, but water sensitive urban design was a very important part of most of their strategies to really align with their thinking about the landscape and ecology, and creating spaces where the health workers and emergency response workers could get out and have some respite in some biophilic spaces. So the project outcomes were great because of the rigor that we'd, I suppose, employed to try and set up a framework where the students could use a tool to analyze the performance of the building. There were some very clear results coming forward about how they could, starting from the typical ambulance station baseline, move towards a net zero carbon potential. and a number of technology measures were identified and prioritized. And this was really useful to Ambulance Victoria, who've been able to integrate actually some of this research as part of their standard specification. So they now have an appendix in their specification, which really puts forward a list of measures that should be incorporated into ambulance stations and prioritizing them. So it's a great piece of work, great outcomes from the studio as a collective that have fed into improvement in the way Ambulance Victoria are carrying out their typical practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And I would like to move on to the next section. And next presenter, it's our experience and our finding from those ideas. I will start with Brendan. Yes.
Thanks, Lou. I'll just share my screen. Actually, Claudio Torres, one of our idea students and now doing some master's research on integrated design studios, is going to talk first. Just get the presentation up and running. Can you see that full screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Claudio, do you want to talk us through some of your slides and analysis on the impact of integrated design on sustainability?
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Thanks very much for having me here. Well, one of my research is actually focusing on transdisciplinary design, but it's adding a complementary lens of what the integrated design method has achieved as an outcome of overlapping the three different disciplines, as, for example, the host discipline would be architecture, then 4 engineering students, and then 2 another environmental students with background in engineering and architecture outcomes. So the complementary lens is trying to focus on the issues and subjects that exist between disciplines and to being able to work across different and beyond all disciplines. If you go to the next slide, please. The next.
There we go. Sorry.
Yeah. So I put this slide here because I found it is this is not business as usual at all. Probably all here know we are super interested on this theme, but it's not the common practice in all pretty much the general in the architecture studios. So I think this variety of participants inside of our studio has been giving like an amazing outcomes in terms of design thinking, and probably we will be seeing these outcomes like after the studio, which is something very like hard to measure, because we are not going to be able to trace students and what are going to be the participation on the industry and probably for their considerations in future studios. Next one. Yeah. So this was part of one of the questions I asked to the students of the IDS Aged Care at Melbourne University, and it is very interesting the way they start recognizing some emerging roles for design collaboration. And one of the main findings of this is like they're naturally recognizing the need for a design integration facilitator in this case, because there are always some divisions, like in terms of technical aspect, then in terms of design, but there is always a gap in between those two. Which can be led by an architect or by an engineering in terms of terms, or maybe they can address some of the technical aspects and maybe measure them against some criteria or targets the group has set up before. And I asked straight to the student what they can say about the areas for improvement in terms of this, how we can improve this collaboration. And I was very surprised by the QUT presentation before, because most of them were addressing that version, and I think that's great, because it's giving us a very good insight of in what could be applicable in the future studios. So mainly, I think students value a lot like the design one-on-one review, and also they need some clarification in the definition of the design process, given the complexity of the integration. And then one of the other ones is setting up some design exchange sessions, which is most in collaboration with their groups and in between amongst the consultants as well, because it's not only, so the whole purpose is getting out of that silo, and sometimes there's a sub silo, which is their group, so they don't know really well what other students are doing, and I think there is an opportunity there to for knowledge sharing amongst students.
Okay, thanks very much, Claudia. I'll take you through some of the findings that are starting to emerge from the IDS as an overall activity, and this will be a joint effort. We'll present the findings from University of Melbourne, and then we'll get QUT and University of Wollongong as well. As Tony said at the start of the session, we're only about 2/3 of the way through, so all of this is sort of in progress. They're thoughts that are coalescing, and hopefully will make their way into the output documentation from the IDSs. So the research on the IDSs happens at 2 levels. The first is on how we get integrated design to happen, and then the bonus is actually around zero carbon research, because we use that as a case study. So in terms of integrated design, we're preparing this document, Catalyst for Integrated Design, which looks at the process and has refined it through every successive studio to hopefully make it more informed. One of the big parts of that is the project planning and procurement. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's some really big moves you can make at the start of a project that's really important to set it up correctly in the first place. Personally, one of my big items is the way that we procure design consultants, and that's fees, and it's also their motivation. So I'm a big fan of alliance contracting. I think we need to do more of it in buildings, or at least some sort of performance-based fees that look at the outcomes rather than just encouraging people to do business as usual. Because like Claudia just mentioned, we need to be beyond business as usual. The other big one there is to write it into the brief as an intended specific thing. So we need to set out to do integrated design at the start, and we need to make sure it appears in everybody's brief along the way. And then there's really the setting up the design environment once everyone's on board. Co-location is a big thing. We mentioned, I think yesterday or the day before, infrastructure do this probably better than architectural buildings, in that they already have project co-located teams and get people face to face, having coffees together and working out of the same offices. Authorship facilitation is another really big thing that we need to concentrate on. It needs senior people involved, so we need to make sure senior people have time allocated at the front end of projects when we procure services. We also need to bring everybody in, including the contractor. And the other thing is to get the best out of every team member, whether they're a quiet, introverted type person or an out there extrovert. Everyone has something to offer to the design, and every discipline has something to offer to the design. So we need to think about how we extract that from people in a non-confrontational way and get them to be contributing to the project overall. So just moving on to the zero carbon side of the research, that's a list of all of the building typologies that we're covering. Would have been great to have done more, but there's limitations on time. And for each one of these, we are producing a set of reports, as David alluded to with the aged care. The consultants actually go through a process after the studios where they vet the designs that the students have produced, and they actually make some conclusions around design moves for zero carbon, basically. And there's lots of reports available on the AIRAH website. I'm not expecting you to read this slide. This is really just a dump of the final paragraph in some of those reports. And it's really just giving you an indication as to how those outcomes look. So in the case of schools, ambulance stations and aged care, zero carbon we found to be absolutely possible. So there should be no excuse not to be aiming for zero carbon design around those facilities, both through looking at ways you can improve the efficiency and then regeneration and other things. Data centres was a bit harder, huge amounts of energy involved. The actual running of the data centre in terms of the building is only 1 to 2.5% of the overall energy, so more difficult to be zero carbon, but you can do some clever things around adjacent usages with things like community assets of swimming pools or greenhouses. So interesting stuff you can actually do around that. And then aquatic centres was a bit of a mixed bag. They're very complex projects. The students found them a very steep learning curve. It's hard to come to definitive conclusions, but WSP, the consultants on this, actually went through and that list of moves on the right there, all of the different facets of the building, they ended up putting together a table of current baseline practice and then future best practice. So there's some really good guidance in that document as to how we can actually get very close towards zero carbon as a building. So look, I would encourage you to have a look at the AIRAH website. All of the reports are able to be downloaded on there. There's research reports, and then there's also the reports, the feasibility vetting reports that the consultants do on each building typology. We will be combining it together in some sort of carbon catalogue type document at the end of the IDSs, so that will hopefully be available mid to late next year. I'm going to hand over to, I believe, either Giorgio from Wollongong or Wendy from QUT.
So together with Brendan and Dominique and Lou from the University of Melbourne, we are assisting in the delivery of the Integrated Design Studios, and Emma and James, my colleagues, yesterday presented the details of those studios. We've got 2 studios that they are almost complete. The classes have finished, but we are now at that stage where we're getting the vetting reports and back from the consultants, and we are processing all the data from the interviews and so on. And the other 2 are halfway complete. We're still running classes this week for those. So I won't cover the details of those IDSs. It was they were covered yesterday by Emma and James. Today I'm just planning to give you a couple of findings or reflection points from the consultants. I would say the students loved the studios and the way the classes run. The consultants also found them very useful. You can see a quote here by one of the consultants. We really pushed the boundaries and we went off script, and we did things that you don't typically see inside classes in universities. And for these 3-4 minutes that I have been allocated today, I'm just going to go through some of the quotes, not all of them, from the consultants, and some of the issues or good things that they noticed for the projects, what enables a successful integrated design. Obviously, you will need a facilitator, or you will need to enable the discussions to take place in the class and between the consultants themselves as well. You've got to make sure that the different levels of expertise don't dominate the discussion by the more experienced people, but there is collaboration between people in the class. You've got to find a balance when working in groups to enable conversations. And you can see one of the consultants says, you know, I can just ask dumb questions just to stimulate a bit discussion and demonstrate by example how to create to those with other, how to relate to those with other viewpoints. And you've got to put all of that into a framework, a well-structured framework to enable engagement and participation. So some additional findings: the importance of the brief and the client. Engagement of the client was a bit more difficult than in a typical consultancy project. Students were not really that brave to come up and chat with the clients. At least for the previous IDSs, it has become a bit better after we saw that appearing last semester. And the another thing is that the client often has a lot of expectations, and you've got to manage those expectations. For one of the sites we are looking at, we were given a list of functionality requirements for the building that they were impossible, I think, to satisfy. Too many spaces for the amount of size, for the land size of the space. Now we ask for ranking of ideas in the class, develop a matrix. We give them a set of criteria to use to the students, and that has been very helpful to them, and they find this process very useful. And the site visits, if you can have site visits, if you have an existing building or a retrofit to work with, that's very helpful and brings the students closer to the consultants, and they can see and they can ask questions and so on. Some of the constraints, the barriers and constraints, obviously one of them is, two consultants mentioned that, it's ego. We must manage our egos, especially if you have very experienced people in the room. And then you can see the ESD consultant here talking about architects that, you know, you've got to be able to tell them to take a step back. So says architects usually take a leadership role and dictate what they want. And then other disciplines need to change and revise their design based on what the architects prefer. And we're trying to bridge that gap. There are a lot of issues with architects. They need more training, blah, blah, blah. So that's a strong view there. And then we've got the architect's view in the next slide. I will just skip this. It is important to find architects and engineers who have a shared philosophy. So really, they have to have an aspiration towards sustainable design and working together. The fees and the time, as Brendan and other people over the last couple of days mentioned, are a barrier. The ego came up again. So this is really the architect's view here. Having engineers at the beginning of projects is very useful, but it comes back to fees and time. Most of the time, the clients want to have the design for the DA ready without having to pay the consultant other than the minimum. So the more input, again, the architect says, the more input you have at the beginning, the better the end product is. But the general feeling is that architecture, in architecture, is that there is always time to change things, which is really not true in most cases. Some other remarks, the architecture students were a bit more comfortable on providing ideas than the engineering students. Attending in person was more important, more easy to communicate and enable discussions. The Zoom really, made things a bit more challenging, as many people mentioned over the last couple of days. And another view here, an interesting view, is that we all understand the concept of green and environmental design these days, but then there is a limited understanding around the impact and the quantification of the design solutions at the early design stage. And finally, I'll close with this slide. The first 2 points were covered by my colleagues yesterday. When you have retrofits, it's much more difficult to generate ideas than when you work with a plain site. And the final point is, especially when you work with plain sites, we found that talking about energy efficiency or renewable energy right at the start of the design is almost non-existent unless you force it. So we took some lessons from last semester, and this semester we made some changes, and we are really forcing those concepts to come right at the start of the design. So we are not allowing the design to proceed unless the students demonstrate that specific renewable energy targets have been met with their design, and we give them some limitations on roof size that they have to deploy renewable energy generation, so that they think at the same time the envelope considerations and the other aspects of the passive aspects of the design. So they think in tandem on how to optimize those. And that's me, Wendy. You can take over here.
It'll actually be Naima who will
okay.
make a few points. Thanks, Naima.
So thank you so much, Wendy. I'm quickly going to share the deck of slides with you all here. So the process of ideas for the design of the aged care mixed-use buildings at QUT is like currently under progress, and we've been collecting data each week from all of the different stakeholders, and we've been analyzing the opportunities, the challenges, and the main ideas that students are exploring. So we have the engineering and construction management students working on their individual projects for their final year of the bachelor's degree. So based on the two different sites, the electrical engineering student, James, is focusing on microgrid supercapacitor and batteries, whereas Ziasab, the Acoustic Construction Management student, is looking at vertical greening systems. And within the Cairns site, which is in the tropical climatic region, the electrical engineering student Jacob is looking at PV and hydrogen and microgrid aspects. And the mechanical engineering student Curtis is looking at solar cooling. And Zach Gales, who's a construction management student, is looking at embodied energy of materials related to durability and costs. And Hinja Wickedon, who's from construction management, is looking at material performance into the future. So each of these students are working in conjunction with the architectural students, which are in their final semester of their one-year-long Master of Architecture degree. So for each of these two different sites, the engineering and construction management students are integrating these systems into the architecture students' designs for the aged care buildings with a mixed-use focus, and the architecture students are then integrating these components in their work. So as a part of the presentation today, in terms of the work in progress, because we still are in week 13, and in week 15 we will have our Masters of Architecture students presenting their final work. I have a student with me here, Tibitin, who's in the first semester of the Master of Architecture program, and she will take you through her design preliminary, and it will act as a sample example of the kind of work that our students are doing here. So over to TB.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm TB. Today I'm gonna show you the briefly background of our current design scheme. So we are designing a multi-generational mixed-use aged care living project which is located in Cambodia, which is subtropical climate. And my design scheme, I named it AND, because there are a lot of combinations and coalescence going on in my whole design. So the young generation and old generation living in the student apartment and independent living apartment, the history and new development, with its unity and diversity. And in the project, I have courtyards and gardens, square and markets, and also consider a lot about the sustainable and universal design. So in respect of the social sustainability and based on my research for the part one of this project, I created a market square in the corner of my design, and which can open up the site and welcome the public to come in. And the main mixed-use residential building have like about 2 wings, the independent living in the east and student apartment in the west. And the space in between those 2 units clusters is a multi-generational communal space with mainly educational functions like library and collaborative studios. I really want to create the atmosphere of like those 2 buildings are actually talk to each other. And the typical plan at the bottom of this page was arranged from different typical units in clusters and enclosed 2 courtyards in the middle to like to allow the whole building to passively ventilated. And the next page is the integrated sustainable design strategies that I have used in my proposal.
We need to wrap it up. Could you wrap it up, please?
Okay. So you can see there are solar panels, solar wing, green facade, and special climate tile for rainwater collection, and also rainwater feature as bell basing and a part of landscape of the whole scheme. So that's all.
Thank you so much, Tibby, for the presentation. So I'll skip this slide. So I think some of the findings that we have had up until now, the preliminary ones, I think they're mutually shared with what Brendan and Georgios has just shared. And I think going forwards, some of the key recommendations in terms of how the IDS process could be improved is that there could be a focus on building services and systems on a weekly basis. It will be better, like some of our architecture students shared, that it would be good if they could have more contact time with the core designers, which includes consultants and the engineering and construction management students. Another, I think, constraint that we found through our IDS process was that the ratio of the architectural students to the non-architectural core designers, I think that's something that needs to be balanced more, because we had about 6 engineering and construction management students and about 30 architectural students. So I think that that ratio needs to be balanced out in the future, so that there could be at least like, 1 engineering student for like, 2 working with 2 architecture students to balance out the outcomes and the facilitation and the support, most importantly, that students need along the way when they're looking at the problems and they're solving those. So that is all from us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for all the presenter. And I would like to call for questions from the floor.
Lou, I might jump in with a quick question just to start things off. And Sasha, I'd be interested in your thoughts, having been in this space for a while, around, we've touched on this, the benefits of having someone to actually facilitate integrated design. So do you see a role for integrated design managers on projects?
I think definitely there's a space for them. Very important also to acknowledge that the facilitation, whether it's kind of a managing role or more like a communicator, however you want to phrase it, that really steps in and explains not only to other people maybe their design strategies or interests on a different level, or tries to facilitate with different communication tools, the communication, but it's also how they picture then the work to the client. Because I think sometimes it's really important to understand for the client what that work actually entails, the collaboration, the effort that is behind all that. It's not only a single point of interest of one of those consultants. They have to work with multiple consultants, have to integrate the work with the architect as well. And this is all something that I guess the clients don't really appreciate quite often, to be honest. It's really, they see in silos that specific point that the consultant's being assigned to, and that's what they have to do, and that's it. But it's way more behind the closed doors, basically, that should happen. And it's something that they definitely need to acknowledge. And therefore, I think the role is quite important.
Thank you, Satya. I got a question for David. David comes from industry. So how do we motivate the industry people to do this integrated design studio?
But Lou, was the question to how do we motivate consultants to get involved in the studios?
Yes.
I mean, look, I think it's a really interesting opportunity from a consultant's perspective to be able to, obviously impart the wisdom and knowledge from the perspective of your particular, discipline, to help, bring that kind of rounded education to students. The opportunity is that you're creating a spark in those students. Like I've seen it in the studios I've been involved with, where they're coming back and saying, wow, I never realized that this is what it was all about. It's really clicks that building design and thinking about creating spaces and buildings is very much a kind of holistic joint process, and enabling them or giving them the freedom to have that holistic thinking, so that they can start to engage with some of these scientific principles or engineering principles if they're coming from an architecture background or from an engineering background, to be posing ideas or putting forward solutions for form and aesthetics. I think it's really exciting for them. So to be involved in that is really great, and you're helping to shape the industry moving forward. And I think you learn something yourself. Like as a consultant, you actually, like just listening to Sasha talking then, it's really interesting. You sort of pose the question, well, why isn't it working so well in industry? What can we do better in industry, and how can we make the most of this collaboration between disciplines in industry? So it really helps you to have that sort of perspective on your own workings and how you work with others. So I think it's so rich, the experience. I would recommend it to any consultant. It's great.
Thank you, David. Dominic.
Thanks, Lou. I had a question for Lindy, and that has to do with, of course, the context that we are in, and we just heard from QUT and saw some examples there. I mean, we're all part of this, I think I get some echo somewhere. We're all part of this program currently, and we will wrap up the program next year, at least in its current version. And it's both maybe QUT, but also the University of Wollongong, checking what are your plans and what are your thoughts in the future, seeing what benefits we get from these types of studios and the positive response we get from students. How do you plan to move this further, even without the umbrella of the funding and the framework that we are currently in with ARENA and AIRAH? What would be your suggestion? And if so, what are your current thoughts about how to achieve that?
Thanks for the question, Dominic. I think absolutely we would love to continue this work and these collaborations, but you hit the nail on the head when you said funding. Of course, we're always under funding pressures, and how do we actually finance the additional additional teaching resources and additional collaborations, it's only fair to pay people for their time. We can't expect people to do freebies. So I guess we've got to convince the university of the value and convince them that we need to support it financially. So I guess that's work that we've got to do in the background. But we're in a bit of a unique situation in that we, as the School of Architecture, have joined the School of Built Environment at the beginning of this year. So for the very first year, we're actually in the same faculty together. So we're all still getting to know each other and our strengths, etc. So, I would have thought that it's a priority for the school going forward is that we do a lot more collaborations and the work that, in the words of our students, they want to see this earlier in their degrees, because we've offered it in the master's program. So I think, in terms of curriculum review and looking at our overall approach in the future, I would like to see these collaborations happening earlier in their degrees. But dollars.
I might just add to that it is dollars more so than the consultants wanting to be involved. All of our existing consultants would be happy to be involved further. And we also have a waiting list of consultants who want to be involved because typically they want to give back to education. They want to help shape future professionals. It's also a means for them to sort of a bit of recruitment drive as well for their companies as well. So the consultants would really like for more integrated design studios to happen. It's how do we make it happen within a restricted funding framework.
Thank you, Wendy. I would suggest, Sacha, you comment, and after that, we wrap it up with Dominic as a leading researcher. Okay.
Okay, yeah, great. Yeah, I just wanted to step into that conversation with funding. I myself was from practice, but also from Swinburne University. And I think David is sort of in a similar shoe here as a practitioner, but also partly working at the university. I think this is sort of the best position of both, obviously. We have the advantage to have a bit of fun at the university, to push boundaries, and at the same time have the reality head on sometimes, because we know how it's like in practice. But I feel also that the work that you've done here with your research project it's great. It's an amazing outcome already. But yeah, we try to implement this very early on. Even though we don't have the funding, we try then to engage more with the engineering faculty itself, rather than we having the consultants on board. It's really about making little first steps, establishing good collaboration between the faculties, because this is sometimes even as hard as consultants working together, sometimes even more harder than you would expect. And I think this will be our take on to slowly progress in that direction. And then also obviously sometimes having the opportunity to get guest crits from consultants areas, different areas involved, which obviously is not as budget heavy. But I think, yes, we definitely tried to implement it already in the bachelor's level and then move on into master's level.
Thank you, Sacha. Dominic, would you mind wrapping it up, please?
Thanks, Lou, and thanks, Sasha. Look, we've come to the end of an exciting 3 days, and I would like to thank everyone who took part in this. We had really interesting presentations on day one from Swinburne University. Daniel, who took us through the studio they're having there, and also talk a little bit about his work with Curvecrete. We have then seen some work that was produced at Melbourne Uni from Toby and Damon from WSP on the aquatic centres. We, of course, also heard a bit of a student perspective, and similar to the video we saw today from QUT, have had students represent and give their feedback, and we can see what sort of, and I think there is a lot of dynamic and there is a lot of energy in what we hear there, and that makes me quite proud and excited and towards the future. I think we really, already by running these studios and educating this new breed of professionals who is very open to these conversations, and then also to a degree knowledgeable, starts to become knowledgeable and enters the industry with the right attitude. It was really great to see that. Day two, Of course, we heard from the University of Wollongong and the great examples that they had there. We heard from Chris Bunting, and I will never forget that soup image. I think everyone was able to relate quite a bit to that sort of analogy that he was bringing. We then switched over to the client side, but also the sort of the studio tutor and consultant side when it came to the ACT projects that we've seen. And today, of course, again, fantastic presentations from QUT, from the Monash Decathlon, so we can see how many different institutions are actually involved in this. We heard from Gumji and David about Ambulance Victoria, and ultimately really was great to see sort of some of the wrapping up of the lessons learned. The program, as I said earlier, as it is about to finish. We have a great number of collaborators, as you can see here, who are part of this and who were part of this, and that number is even growing. It's good to see that we need to establish waiting lists, which is, I'm very happy to hear that from you, Wendy, about people who would like to join. And in one way or the other, I'm absolutely certain that we will continue the Integrated Design Studios, and funding will remain an issue, but I think with a bit of creativity, we will be getting there, and we will get to the right sort of point in terms of where we want to be. I would like to thank everyone who was part of this over the last 3 days. I would like to also thank, of course, our audience for shooting us through interesting questions and being part of the conversation. It was great. We had 150 registrations across the 3 days, which is great. And last up, really, a slide that was taken recently from a part of a sort of symposium that we took part in with CSIRO, where we discussed integrated design and where they picked up on some of the comments that we made. And maybe as a final comment for everyone before I will ask AIRAH to wrap this session up here. So adapt or perish, I think, is a key message to, and I don't think we need to tell this to anyone here in this room, but maybe out there in the industry, I think things are changing, and they're changing for the better. And that would be my closing comment. Handing over to you, Marie. Thanks.
Yeah, so that does bring the symposium to a close, everyone. So I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who registered and attended the sessions over the past 3 days. And a special thanks to all the project partners, leaders, and also the presenters. The recording from the symposium will be made available to the public within the next couple of weeks, and I'll send out an email and let everybody know when that does become available as well. As previously mentioned, the Ihub will host its 4th instalment of the Free Knowledge Sharing Summit, which would take place on November 23. Online in conjunction with the AIRAH Future of Hvac event, and more information regarding that summit will be made available, so please stay tuned. And for more information regarding Ihub and to view any of the past recordings, please visit the Ihub website, which is ihub.org.au. And until next time, I look forward to you joining us again. So thank you, everybody. Take care.